Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Global Politics Podcast at the end of history. My name is Alex Hochuli. I'm with George Hoare and Philip Cunliffe, and collectively we are BungaCast. Hello, guys.
Hey.
Yo.
So we are obviously, often talking about the end of history, but we're going to roll back and talk about the end of history now and how it ended. What you're going to hear shortly is my interview with Fritz Bartel on his book, The Triumph of Broken Promises, which is a phenomenal book, in my opinion. I was asked to review it, and I was initially actually perhaps not so keen because the title didn't entirely grab me. It seemed like a perhaps sort of idealist sort of take on, or a complaint that governments broke promises. But what I actually discovered is that it is a very novel and engaging take on the end of the Cold War and the rise of neoliberalism. And it brings those together in a very incisive way, which is able to dialogue between the domestic and international contexts, both East and West, and to bring East and West and their experiences together. Anyway, I thought it was great. I think this comes through in the review that I wrote for American Affairs. And I'm eager to hear what Phil and George have to make of it. I don't know about you guys, but the history of the Cold War is interesting, like to put it in the most kind of bland terms possible, as an important historical period. But what's important, I guess, in trying to understand how it ended and what it led to is to understand kind of capitalist development and how we find ourselves where we are now. And I guess that's what's important and makes it more than just of historical interest.
Yeah, I mean, not to make it all about us and our book, but the way that we frame the end of history period is that it directly follows the Cold War period. So I think it's got direct relevance to us and the framework that we established in our book. And so I think, hearing an expert talk about how and why it came to an end is I think really looking forward to hearing the interview.
I mean, the reason I'm very interested in the book is because it's part of this something we've been talking about, as George suggests. The end of neoliberalism, and whether it's whether it is actually over and what that looks like. So, or at least that's the kind of the moment in which the book has been launched, and it contributes to that debate. So I'm very curious to. Having enjoyed your review, Alex, I'm very curious to hear what the author has to say. So,
okay, great. Well, you, dear listener, are going to hear me interviewing Fritz Bartel. You're going to hear, I guess, about 2/3 of the 1.5 hour long interview. If you want the rest of it, where we expand a little bit and try to look forward as well, trying to take the insights of the book and see what it might suggest, not about the rise of neoliberalism, but its ending, as Phil has just mentioned. That'll be over on our Patreon. That's at patreon.com/BungaCast. And it will also be followed by the after party, where the three of us discuss a little bit more deeply some of the political lessons that the book suggests. Just before you listen to the interview, I just wanted to remind listeners, if you're a regular listener and are a fan of what we do, please consider dropping us a review wherever you listen to your podcast, whether it's on iTunes, on our Facebook page, or wherever else it might be. We would greatly appreciate that. Anyway, here's the interview. This is me talking to Fritz Bartel. All right. Hello. I'm here with Fritz Bartel, who's Assistant Professor of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. He's a member for Grand Strategy there, which sounds impressive or ominous, depending on your perspective. And I'm delighted to be here with Fritz to talk about his book, which I had the pleasure of recently reviewing. It's The Triumph of Broken Promises, The End of the Cold War and the Rise of Neoliberalism, which will be coming out very shortly from Harvard University Press, depending on when exactly you're listening to this. How's it going, Fritz? I imagine you're pretty excited for the book to actually finally come out.
I am, Alex. Thanks so much for having me on the show. And I am very excited to have it finally appear, very excited to hear people's thoughts on it and to have conversations like this one. So looking forward to it with not too many nerves, but hopefully the appropriate amount. Not the conversation, but the book launch itself.
Yeah. No. And, despite what, even if you spill the beans on what's in the book in this discussion here, people should definitely go out and buy it and read it, because I think it will shape people's thinking in quite an important way about about a relatively recent past, but whose consequences are very much felt right now. I mean, the Ukraine war actually adds a sort of extra piquancy to what you depict in the book. So it's amazing. It's a great time for the book to be coming out. So before we actually get into that content, your book, for people who are completely unfamiliar with it, it's about a relationship, an intimate relationship, as it turns out, between the rise of neoliberalism and the end of the Cold War. And you know that it's not been studied very much. And I think if you're probably to ask someone what the relationship was between neoliberalism and the end of the Cold War, you probably wouldn't get much further than people saying something like, Ronald Reagan was a neoliberal president and he increased US military spending, and then the Eastern Bloc wasn't able to keep up. And that was, the end of really existing socialism. And then afterwards, neoliberalism took over the globe. And actually, that is in some ways even kind of marginal to your narrative. So which we'll get into. We'll get into in just a second. But I wanted to ask before that, what your intellectual background was and what turned you on to this idea of exploring the linkage between these two, which, as you say, hasn't been studied that much.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks very much for having me. And it's great to kind of talk about the origins of this project, because I feel very lucky to have in many ways stumbled upon it, because it was one that kept on growing. I mean, I really began interested in the fact that when the Berlin Wall came down, I learned, as I was kind of desperately searching for a dissertation to write, which many graduate students do, learned that the Eastern Bloc was $90 billion in debt to the capitalist world when the Berlin Wall came down. And that just sparked a series of questions in my mind. First of all, I didn't know that was true. I don't think, like you said, I don't think it's become more well known since I started studying this in the far too long ago, early 2010s. But why did that happen? I was interested. Why were capitalists lending money to communists? Why were communists borrowing from capitalists? That relationship was something I really wanted to dig into, and I thought that would really be the entire project. Perhaps with a comment, if I could find it, on what was the ultimate effect of this debt on the events of 1989. We had a sense from some of the literature that there was some marginal impact. There had certainly been studies that there was an economic kind of background force that had played a role in the end of the Cold War, but it didn't seem to me to be very well specified. And so I started to do research on that, kind of telling the history of the revolutions of 1989 through the lens of sovereign debt. When you find documents at places like the IMF, with Polish officials telling the fund that the Roundtable Agreement of 1989 is a political way to achieve their economic ends. That as a historian, finding that kind of evidence is pretty special, because it puts it right out there for you to see. And I started to find that over and over again in these revolutions. So that was the origins of the Eastern side of the project, I guess, the communist side. And as I was doing that, I then, historian Charles Mayer, well-known international historian of Europe, I discovered had long been writing about how, and he, in fact, in 1991 wrote an article stating that for a future history of the fall of communism and capitalism had to be told as part of a shared history. Basically, their history in the 70s and 80s was a shared one. And some of the crises of capitalism were also crises of communism that ultimately proved fatal to really existing socialism. He wrote a single book about East Germany, but basically that agenda of trying to tell these two sets of crises of capitalism and communism together became the driving force behind the book, and from that kind of conviction that the sides of the story had to be told together, that produced the revolutions of '89, and also produced what we now would think of as the neoliberal turn in the West. That became the kind of driving conviction for the book. So, in terms of my own background, I mean, I'm first and foremost a international historian, a diplomatic historian of kind of geopolitics. But as I lay out in the introduction to the book, I don't think, particularly in this period, you get very far in the history of geopolitics without studying the kind of the domestic economic restructuring and changes in ideology, changes in politics that are happening on both sides of the Iron Curtain in the 70s and 80s. And so that's how I started to try to tell this story.
Yeah, no, and the way that you're able to synthesize the kind of histories East and West, as well as the domestic and the international sphere, and the kind of the simultaneous things that were going on, is impressive, and it's one of the things that really brings the book to life. I don't want to talk too much at the beginning. I want to let you speak. So you have, what could be seen as a narrative that of linear cause and consequence that appears very neat in my head if I try to reconstruct. Okay, what's the kind of argument that you're trying to prove of cause and consequence? And it sounds, when I retell it in my own head, maybe even too neat. And it starts with the oil price shocks of the 70s and ends with global neoliberalism under American global hegemony. But this is kind of what happened, and you demonstrated, I think, very convincingly. So just to set us up, could you broadly talk us through the sequence of events to properly situate us among the pivotal moments and forces of your account from the early 70s to the early 90s?
Yeah, and this will be a narrative challenge for myself to try to do this briefly, and so I hope it comes across to your listeners. Basically, I set up the book around a central change that I believe happened in the early 1970s, and that was this change from the race to make promises, the Cold War being a race to make promises. Basically, the two sides, communism, state socialism, and democratic capitalism, trying to make promises to their people to expand their social contracts, to provide basically a broadly more equitable and bountiful distribution of modernity's good life, is I think how I put it in the introduction. The two sides disagreed over exactly what set of promises. They were offering two different sets of promises, but they were their contest, when it wasn't in the military sphere, when it wasn't in the purely ideological sphere, was one about delivering a higher standard of living to the majority of their populations, right? And kind of the picture, the moment that I think encapsulate this is the so-called kitchen debate between Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev in 1959, where they're in Moscow debating basically the merits of their two ways of life and which one can provide more material goods. It's a consumerist vision. It's also one bound up with industrialization, providing this broadly shared prosperity to their people, including technological advancements and how that will transform the lives of people living under state socialism or democratic capitalism. Around 1970, that begins to change, and what I argue in the book and then trace throughout the whole book is this: it changes to a race to break promises. It changes to it's an unfortunate race. There's nothing really to be celebrated about it. But in terms of explaining political change that does start to occur in the 1970s and 1980s, the challenge for the two sides becomes which ones can break promises to their people, which ones can discipline their social contract. Because as I started to look at the major moments of political change that happened in the 70s and 80s, they often were centered around governments trying to impose, broadly speaking, policies of economic discipline, a little bit more broad of a term than purely austerity, but policies of economic discipline. So closing down on unprofitable enterprises, imposing fiscal or monetary austerity on their own people. It could be reforming trade unions, instituting policies that bring about unemployment. There's a whole host of policies that, depending on the place or the time or which system you are a part of, kind of takes different forms. But I think the way that I tried to unite the story of democratic capitalism and state socialism is around this idea of a politics of breaking promises. Which one could implement this politics of breaking promises? So anyway, as I started to think about the history of the 70s and 80s through this lens of broken promises, that seemed to me to be the ultimate kind of driving force that pushed politics forward during this period. If we think about the policies of Ronald Reagan or Paul Volcker and Ronald Reagan in the United States, obviously Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, but also including Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, and the reformers eventually in Poland and Hungary that instituted the Round Table democratization. All of these forms of new thinking, so new thinking is a term usually that comes out of the Soviet discourse around Gorbachev. It's usually thought of as his idealistic and his kind of group of reformers, their idealistic vision, particularly about foreign policy. But when you take it out of that context, there's in fact new thinking, of course, going on all over the place in the 70s and 80s. And my contention in the book is that this new thinking is adopted in East and West to meet this challenge of breaking promises. And the challenge arises because nation states, the kind of materialist foundation of all of this is that after 1973, after the oil crisis, which arrives at a moment when economic growth in both East and West has slowed down significantly. The oil crisis creates it doesn't fully create, but it dramatically expands two new pools of wealth, which we now know very well. Energy wealth, if you're an energy producer, you all of a sudden, almost overnight, in a matter of months, have more money than you possibly know what to do with. Mm-hmm. And if you are not an energy producer, or if you're a home for global finance, like the United States, you then, the role of finance in your economy also begins to explode or right. is accelerated dramatically. And if you're not a home for global finance or an energy producer, then you need access to finance in order to delay this process of breaking promises. So in order to delay economic adjustment to the oil price shocks and to the broader inflationary crisis of the 1970s. Yeah. And so,
So I mean, we live in a world which is so financialized now. It's almost hard to imagine the world, pre the 1970s, before all the petrodollars started flowing into Eurodollar markets and creating these whole new financial markets, which we now take for granted because they dominate so much of the economy and have seeped into the functioning of the real economy itself. So maybe as a way to kind of depict this, could you maybe just run through the linking between these new economic factors and the political decisions it imposed on policymakers, East and West?
Yeah. So the oil crisis is far from the only factor that produces stagflation in the West, but it is certainly one that accelerates that process. And then governments in the West are broadly trying to defer any kind of adjustment or defer adjustment to stagflation, which would imply a disciplinary shock to their own people, or at least to their economy, some section of their economy, by borrowing on international capital markets, by using international capital as a way to defer the shock. Similarly, in the Eastern Bloc, the oil crisis arrives as a moment that's really fraught for the Soviet Union itself, because it is one of the world's largest energy producers. This is then a dramatic windfall for their overall wealth. At the same time, however, they're providing that energy to their satellites in the Eastern Bloc at fixed prices, which then once the world price quadruples, that becomes an enormous subsidy to them. And so they have to, over time, they have to now decide, basically overnight, just as quickly as the oil crisis arrives, the Eastern Bloc becomes an enormous burden, economic burden to the Soviet Union. That had already been true to a certain extent prior to that. There were Soviet economists that were already saying in the 60s that they were a burden, but it was no doubt true by the 70s. And so they slowly start to kind of wean the rest of the bloc off of this energy subsidy over the course of the 1970s and 1980s. But that takes quite a long time to happen. And as it's happening, the Eastern Bloc governments themselves are also turning to these Eurodollar markets as a means of avoiding having to impose any kind of structural adjustment or austerity policy domestically, which would most likely come in the form of price increases on basic consumer goods, or that's usually the policy that they were debating at the time. And so
basically they're shifting what they're dependent on, right? They're dependent on cheap energy from the USSR, which paints a different picture to the one of just pure political domination, because they are effectively, right. Those regimes are dependent on that cheap energy, and they shifted instead basically towards debt.
Right, and for the historian, the amazing part to see, and I try to pull this out in the book. If you're someone like East Germany, the East German officials are trying to get as much from the Soviet Union as they can. And so they very clearly, they put it down, they kind of count it up. If you don't give us this amount of energy at this price, that is going to lead to exactly this amount, these extra billions in debt. And they go to Soviet officials and they say, look, this is exactly what's going to happen if you don't give us energy. And for a while it works. The Soviets are kind of, they buy into this, they give them some more energy through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. So in a pinch, you could still turn to the Soviet Union to get out of that. But as soon as that energy surplus, we could say, or the Soviet Union's ability to cover its allies' extra costs diminishes, which arrives in the 1980s, they really have nowhere left to turn for their dependence besides Western capital. And that's when things start to change dramatically, beginning in Poland in the early 1980s.
So this is a situation which gives, by the early 1980s, the US an incredible amount of leverage suddenly, which it didn't have. And this is, I guess, where the narrative departs a bit from the common sense understanding that many people have, which places a lot of emphasis on simply US military spending, and the US kind of outspending the USSR on military equipment, and that was basically the story of the end of the Cold War. So maybe talk us through what the mechanisms are by which the US gains all this leverage, not just over the Second World, but also over the Third World.
Right. So there's this enormous change from 1979 to 1985. I call it the Capitalist Perestroika, because in fact, Soviet officials were, I found when I went to archives in Moscow, actually using the term perestroika to refer to economic change in the capitalist world before Gorbachev kind of started using the term to refer to the socialist world. And so again, it even in linguistically, in Russian, what's happening in the 1980s is perestroikas are happening all over the world, right? It's not just, of course, it's happening in the Soviet Union, but it's also happening in other places. And so that was one way to kind of shift our frame of reference again. But nevertheless, once the kind of key moment for the rise of U.S. leverage is exactly the moment at which the United States imposes this discipline on itself. So the Volcker shock, Paul Volcker's dramatic shock to U.S. dollar interest rates beginning in 1979, but really taking off after the presidential election of 1980, causes the largest, up to that time, recession in the United States post-war period. It's completely government caused. There's no kind of way of shifting the blame to someone else. In a sense, you can say it's caused by the second oil crisis, but it's really the central bank not allowing the inflationary shock of the second oil crisis to be passed on into the economy. And so there's no mistaking who's causing this recession. It is the U.S. central bank. But that not only cuts off inflation in the United States, it also shuts down this petrodollar recycling process that had been creating or allowing for this dependence of the Eastern Bloc to exist. And as soon as the petrodollar recycling machine dries up in the early 1980s, all of these countries now, kind of the question is called on their economic solvency, so to speak, and they have to turn somewhere to either get bailed out once again or turn and impose austerity on their own people. They try to go to the Soviet Union. This is exactly the moment at which the Soviet Union repeals the so-called Brezhnev doctrine internally. So it says basically the cost is too high. Even if Solidarity, the resistance and labor union in Poland that was resisting the Polish government, even if they come to power, we're going to have to let that happen because the costs are just too much for us.
And it's not bailing out countries in the third world either. I mean, it's not providing maybe the kind of credit that they might have done at an earlier phase. So this is really a kind of global moment, right? It's a sovereign debt crisis in the third world, the IMF bailouts and conditionality. Like it's all right there in this moment. Right,
and I think that part, particularly when it's in reference to the third world, is well known that the U.S. in the 1980s gains this leverage over the third world. What I try to draw on in my book is that leverage only comes about because it also imposes discipline domestically. So these two processes are interlinked. So basically, the United States, at least the American people, the U.S. government is a different story altogether. But the American people don't get off without any kind of disciplinary effect in the early 1980s. But it does also, this process that is more well known in the third world certainly applies in the second world as well. And so it first comes in the form of what I call the bailouts of Eastern Europe, because the first thing that the U.S. government and the IMF and the Bank of International Settlements do is provide extra liquidity to countries like Hungary and East Germany and Poland, not quite Poland, but certainly Hungary and East Germany. And then these countries, for a minute, regain access to global capital markets in kind of 1983, 84, 85. There's a very interesting relationship that develops between Hungary and Japan, for instance. So kind of these links, the global financial links are truly global at this stage. So by the late
Tokyo,
1980s,
it's Tokyo suddenly bailing out Budapest because suddenly there's this new availability of funds from Japan. So it's constantly shifting, it seems.
Yeah, basically the country with the surplus money, right? In the 70s, it was the oil producers of the Middle East. It was OPEC. By the 80s, the surplus countries, number one above all, is Japan. And so Japan is both funding U.S. federal deficits and also funding Hungarian deficits, current account deficits. Because Japanese capital, and really capitalists in general, I discovered during this project, don't really care about politics one way or another.
Right.
Even in the Cold War, when I guess I would have thought that they would have had some sort of ideological aversion to the communist world. It didn't matter one way or another. It was simply about, are you a good bet or not?
Right.
And in the 70s, it appeared that the socialist world was the best bet that could be made, ironically, because they had the Soviet Union backing them up and because they had authoritarianism, which was assumed to be the system that would be able to impose adjustment if needed. It turned out, of course, in the 80s that the opposite was true. And by 87, 88, in particular, global capital loses confidence in Poland and Hungary. They can't turn to the Soviet Union, and so they have to turn to the IMF, which is demanding, as it always does, significant structural adjustment and austerity programs. And in order to gain society's acceptance for these programs, and this is, I was astounded to kind of find the fairly explicit evidence for this, that they begin this process of roundtable democratization as a way of gaining society's acceptance of austerity.
So can you just briefly talk us through what this roundtable democratization actually entailed? And then I want to come on to the real content of Broken Promises.
Sure. So maybe the Polish roundtable is easiest to kind of talk about. So in early 1988, the Polish government is trying to gain society's acceptance for austerity. They offer a referendum to the country asking basically would you be okay with economic reform if it entailed 2 to 3 years of hardship, or I can't remember the exact wording, but something like that. The referendum actually fails, but they go ahead and do it anyway. That's a recipe for society to push back significantly. And then in the spring of 1988 and the summer of 1988, Solidarity, and really just broadly speaking, the Polish working class rise up against this austerity movement, these austerity measures. And the government, by the fall of 1988, has decided that if we're going to gain social peace in a time of economic austerity, we need to bring society's stakeholders into the government in some form. And so what becomes this roundtable negotiation, because it took place around table, it includes the Catholic Church, it includes Solidarity, it includes the government. It's this attempt to actually work towards a re-legalization of the labor union Solidarity, and also to launch really semi-democratic elections, partially free elections in the summer of 1989.
Yeah, there's a great bit in the book where you note, also, taking, I think, from archival research, that Solidarity, the trade union founded in the Gdansk shipyards in 1980, that it was probably the only labor union in the world that welcomed its nation's membership in the IMF, precisely because it saw the power that fund conditionality might have to actually change the political status quo in Warsaw. I thought that's great. I think that it sheds a light on the way that these economic constraints force all these contradictions within countries which are especially indebted countries.
Yeah, and at the same time they said, I don't know if I can't remember if I quoted exactly, but they said we want conditionality without the conditions of substantial austerity. Basically, we want kind of economic reform that doesn't involve just outright lowering the standard of living. That was not something the IMF was interested in doing. The IMF was always interested in basically creating a capital outflow from the country to start debt repayments, right? But that pressure. So this is where the book doesn't have there's no winner or good guy in this process, I guess, right? So the pressure to, it wasn't simply pressure for economic reform, it was pressure to exact an economic price that drives the political change forward, right? So Solidarity even isn't really getting what it wants from the IMF either. The government certainly isn't getting it, and Solidarity isn't either, but what it does produce ultimately is at least what we now think of as the peaceful end of the Cold War. So that's the ironic byproduct, I guess, of this process.
So, I mean, we're getting towards what the broken promises are and why the West was able to break promises and the East wasn't. And you've already detailed the way that the US was dealt some great cards to play, which wasn't necessarily the product of the genius of its policymakers or necessarily of some particular benefit that the US had, but it was a kind of product of complex economic and kind of impersonal movements that happened, the oil price rise and the creation of these new financial markets and so on. So the US suddenly had this hand to play, but it also was able to impose the economic discipline that you argue was necessary, that it wasn't a choice, but it was a kind of external constraint that imposed itself. And yet the East, and this is really counterintuitive, you've already hinted at this, it's really counterintuitive, but these seemingly more authoritarian regimes were unable or unwilling to impose that same sort of economic discipline, despite the ability to repress any sort of dissent and so on, and quash resistance, that they were unwilling to do that. And I think that, I mean, it's such an interesting argument that's made in the book. So maybe talk us through that. Why was the West able to impose economic discipline and the East wasn't?
Yeah. So I guess I'll start by saying if I'm right about this, which I guess we can leave open as a question too, and we'll see what other people think. But I don't think I have the full answer, or maybe the answer is a very complicated one. But the two things that I point to in the book are democracy as a way to so basically their governments having the legitimacy provided by democratic elections that allows their people to trust the government that in some way what is happening to them is necessary, whether or not it actually is, right? But when a government turns to its people and says, rather than this kind of under the race to make promises, this thing that had started the Cold War, when your government is promising and then actually providing a better life and a higher standard of living and a sense of that the future will be better, it maybe is a little bit easier to trust, or perhaps trust and legitimacy don't really matter under those circumstances. And in fact, late socialism, as it is called, right, relied on this basic trade-off of providing a incremental increase in the standard of living in exchange for kind of politically opting out or not challenging the political system. That was the basis of the late socialist social contract. In the West, this democratic legitimacy does provide governments with this ability to gain social trust. And again, this was not something that it's not even an argument I make directly, but I actually see it in the evidence coming from the East. So I detail the diaries of this Polish policymaker, Mieczysław Rakowski, who sees, as soon as Solidarity starts to, so in a sense, the first democratically elected government since the Second World War for Poland, or since the start of the Cold War, he says our society kind of patiently takes on hyperinflation and doesn't react negatively, precisely because it's our government, he says, right? That people think that it's our government. And this sense that if, as long as it's your government that is doing something to you, again, I'm making it based on the evidence that I saw. I don't even necessarily, I don't have like an internal conviction that this is true, but it seemed to be true for people at the time. That was a very important element of the conditions under which austerity or economic discipline was imposed. And so
that was at least the perspective, at least from the perspective of the policymakers themselves, that they felt that they could impose discipline and get away with it. Even because I think that it's another claim entirely whether democracy actually gave regimes a level of trust to impose that discipline, because of course there was resistance to neoliberalism in Britain, and you talk about the miners' strike, for example, right, which is a really pivotal moment. Maybe we'll come to talk a little bit about that in a bit. But as you say, I think it's the claim at least is legitimate insofar as this is what people were thinking. This is what policymakers thought. In the East, as you detail, they were scared of imposing economic discipline because of what it might mean for their own legitimacy. Whereas in the West, there was some prevarication, right? It took some kind of reasonably exceptional political figures in the form of Thatcher. I mean, I'm not regular listeners will be surprised to hear me talk up Thatcher, but I guess there is a sort of grudging respect for her capacity to do what was seen as politically impossible at the time, and take on the unions in a head-on collision rather than seek to find a negotiated settlement, which had been the ways of policymaking throughout the 1970s up to that point. One way that you depict this, and maybe this is a good way to kind of talk a little bit more about these broken promises and why in the West they were able to, and in the East they felt they were unable to, is this comparison that you make precisely between Mieczysław Rakowski, who was an economist and advisor in Poland, and Thatcher's advisor, John Hoskins. because I think that really brings it to life about what policymakers were thinking at the time and what they felt they could kind of get away with, and what techniques of government they would need to be able to impose this economic discipline, which in the East they felt they wanted to, or they would have to, because they couldn't rely on ever increasing debt forever. Eventually those bills would have to be paid, but that they had to find some means of going about it, and neoliberal governments in the West found it, and in the East they didn't. So maybe talk us through a little bit that comparison between those advisors.
Sure, absolutely. So this man Rakowski, he ends up, he's seen as kind of a Polish liberal, in the sense of kind of not, he's part of the communist establishment, but he's not a central member of the party. And he begins to see in the late 1970s that clearly the economy is not going well, and that there is a moment approaching at which the government or the party will need to institute some sort of economic reform that he believes will require many years, a number of years of poor economic performance as the economy is reset. And he senses already in the late 1970s that the government does not have the trust, basically the social trust of the people in order to do this. And so he starts to advocate for what he calls co-responsibility, basically bringing the Catholic Church and labor unions, this is before the emergence of Solidarity, labor unions, so the party-sponsored labor unions, more into the governing process as a way of building the social trust. At the same time, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, this man, John Hoskins, is working out of government at this time on basically the blueprint of the Thatcher Revolution, and he feels that he needs, obviously the Thatcher government, once it's in power, will need to convince people that a dramatic change in how Britain is governed is necessary, and that events, so he calls it events-led communication, basically letting strikes happen and having them communicate a message to the British people, will be ultimately successful in changing their opinions of trade unions, giving at least tacit acceptance to, tacit support to Thatcher herself, and allow an economic transformation to occur. So we have these two visions of economic transformation and what will be required on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Rakowski ends up in government after Solidarity emerges. He tries to make this vision of co-responsibility a reality with Solidarity. And over time, it just becomes clear in basically over the course of what is called the Polish crisis, that the two sides can't agree on any form of shared political control. Basically, Solidarity wants ever more political control over things like the distribution of food in Poland, over the course of economic reform. And he, Rakowski, and the government in general, the party, are not willing to give up any real political power to make this happen. So this vision of co-responsibility is not really any kind of real vision for shared power. It's really more of would be a way of kind of co-opting social forces into the governing vision. After it becomes clear to both sides that there is no future for sharing power, the only turn, so I at the end of the chapter, I use Thatcher's infamous phrase of defeating the enemy within. Right? If you think about Britain and Poland in the early 1980s, as I write, Wojciech Jaruzelski, the military leader of Poland, could not have imagined a better term for solidarity than the enemy within. And he defeats his enemy within through martial law. Thatcher defeats what she calls the enemy within in the British miners' strike, with what is viewed as just much as more legitimate force. And so I cite some polling numbers from this period where Thatcher herself has an approval rating of something like 45%. But the British police, the kind of state, the enforcement arm of the state, has an approval rating of 91%. If you were in Poland at the time, I couldn't find, at least, perhaps it exists, some sort of approval ratings of the Polish security services. I don't think they would be 91%. And so I think this is where the idea of legitimacy and how whether or not the two sides have legitimacy proves decisive in which ones are able to impose economic discipline without fully leading to a collapse or a breakdown of the governing regime.
Yeah. Yeah, and in relation to that, there's a great moment that you describe, or at least, recount what was written in diaries, that the first post-communist prime minister in Poland was then swiftly able to impose all sorts of economic discipline. And then you have Rakowski looking at that and going, kind of, God damn it, we were, if this had been us, we would have been slaughtered for this. Like, there would have been so much resistance. Yeah. And now in this new capitalist regime where they're able to get away with it. And it does, and it's striking. Again, it underlines the point that you make throughout the book, that democracies were able to impose this sort of discipline in the way that the authoritarian state socialism wasn't. And it's a point that's also made up, I think, in reference to regimes in the third world as well, that many of the ones who imposed austerity in the 1980s were democracies by that point. I mean, I'm familiar with Brazil, and that was definitely the case in the late 80s, early 90s. And I guess it makes something like the Pinochet coup in Chile stand out, perhaps maybe even as an exception, oddly, because we tend to think of that as the beginning of neoliberalism, and no doubt, even under democratic forms, the imposition of neoliberal austerity and economic discipline is done with a lot of repression, undoubtedly. But they're somehow very often able to get away with it, at least for a while, in a way that even the kind of capitalist dictatorial regimes, like the military dictatorships in Latin America, weren't able to do, or weren't willing to do. And I wonder, I wonder if, so I guess my question is whether that's purely a facet of the type of regime that it was, that these dictatorships weren't willing to do that, or if it was more just a kind of coincidence of timing, that there was still strong growth in the 60s and 70s when there were these dictatorial regimes in place, and then certainly by the later 80s, there's a democratic transition going on everywhere, and that they then impose economic discipline because it's necessary. The kind of growth is no longer, the growth engine's no longer there.
Yeah, and actually, this is something I'm hoping to work on in the future. Kind of what the extent to which these dynamics of this pressure for economic discipline driving what is called the third wave of democratization, how much they are related. I think there is certainly one element of it is just an anti-incumbent or whoever's in power at the time during this long period in the 70s of delaying adjustment, and when that period ends, whoever's in power, if it's Jimmy Carter in the United States or James Callaghan in the UK, there are changes in government, and one of the things that democracies were able to do is change who was in power and at least have people believe. If you were in the Soviet Union, you didn't think there was much difference between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. But if you were in the United States, I think you did. And historians tend to treat that as a major departure in U.S. history without declaring it kind of the full-blown collapse of the governing system itself, like we saw at the end of the 1980s in the Eastern Bloc. And so the other thing that democracy, electoral democracy at least, allows capitalist societies to do is to change their governing ideology to a certain degree, at least, while maintaining kind of full regime continuity, if you like. And so they can be more flexible. At least they could at that time. be more flexible. Whereas as soon as Gorbachev tried to change the governing ideology in the Soviet Union and across the Eastern Bloc, it very, very quickly kind of collapsed in on itself.
Right. And I mean, in this narrative, obviously it can be read in a deterministic manner, but I think you're very careful in the way that you put this together in terms of laying out what these real material constraints are. But, your account doesn't do away with agency and contingency. It shows that, choices were still available to actors, but, within often straitened circumstances. And so they could sometimes delay or, extend and pretend, as it's called in our times, with regard to kind of the, Euro crises and whatever, or what Wolfgang Strick has called buying time, kicking the can down the road, and so on, all these sort of metaphors. But ultimately, kind of, reality comes knocking. And I guess in that element of, of contingency and agency, you dip your toe into counterfactuals, right? So basically, to put it bluntly, it's could it have been otherwise, right? Was there some other solution in the East which wouldn't have led to the complete collapse of those regimes? And indeed, probably in the West, was there a different solution which didn't require the same imposition of economic discipline, whether some negotiated solution could have been found out for, whatever. The narrative that you tell suggests that and prompts those questions of counterfactuals, and you hint at them in the book, but it kind of without necessarily exploring them fully. So maybe this might be an opportunity just to round out this section here to maybe speculate a little bit about what other avenues might have been possible and when, perhaps not by 1986, but perhaps in 1978 or so on.
Yeah. Well, I think since you rightly raised it in your review, and I will say, hopefully your listeners have gone out and read it, and they should read it. It's shorter than my book, so go out and read
but they should
read
the whole narrative. They should read the whole thing. They can read my review.
Yeah. No. Well, I think you're absolutely right to raise this question, and as the person who kind of wrote this seemingly or treading towards deterministic narrative, I don't know that I'm the best one to think through alternatives. A couple of that obviously present themselves. I think the combination of Volcker and Reagan was an enormously detrimental, to say the least. But their combination, they often, I think, in neoliberal accounts go together. But there's no reason that they had to, and in fact, they almost didn't. Right. So Volcker himself is trying to. I mean, he's appointed by Jimmy Carter. He's trying to not interfere in the 1980 presidential election by tanking the economy before the election. I don't think there's probably an empirical answer to this question, but I don't think he had any preference, at least before 1980, for Ronald Reagan. And certainly after his election and after the tax cuts are passed, this creates this double whammy, to use a non-technical term, of these extremely high interest rates and these enormous budget deficits in the United States, which creates an enormous sucking motion for global capital, right? All of a sudden, capital is flowing into the United States at rates that were just basically thought to be impossible a few short years earlier. And what this effect the effect that this has is to shut down or to create these moments of leverage in the second and third world that I don't think would have been as severe. So do you get a sovereign debt crisis, or at least at the scale that it happened, if you don't have both Volcker and Reagan's policies at the same time? I don't think you do. And so if there was a more measured, people debate even if what Volcker did was in any way necessary in the United States, or if he kind of adopts a more gradual approach, if there is no enormous tax cut program for the wealthy in the United States, that would have global effects out far beyond the U.S. borders. And I think you'd have a very different history of the 1980s. Another enormous one, which will face no doubt in the coming 2020s is the prospect of global debt relief in the 1980s. So there were lots of calls for global debt relief, kind of ways out of the sovereign debt crisis of the 1980s that didn't involve continued structural adjustment and austerity programs in the third world and the second world. And the extent to which, with Reagan in power and even just with the US Treasury and German government kind of controlling the IMF, the extent to which those were plausible, given the relations of power at the time, I don't know. I think that's still kind of a question open for research. But had that come to pass, had there been a significant form of debt relief in the 1980s, that would have had dramatic impacts, almost certainly, obviously, much more humane impacts for people around the world, but also you likely would have had a much longer Cold War, right? Because the kind of leverage that I lay out in my book would have disappeared. And in fact, the Polish government in the 1980s is counting on this happening. They're hoping that they can buy enough time for a kind of global debt relief package to take shape, and it just doesn't do that. So those two moments stand out to me as ones where history could have gone a different direction, and hopefully my book will lead to more productive thought on those questions.
Excellent. No, very good stuff. I think it's interesting that despite that. And despite the fact that you are explicit that it's not a triumphalist narrative that you want to present, but it's, I think, a very realist one, and it's commendable for that. There's nevertheless a kind of, if I can put it this way, a sort of Leninist almost admiration for the ability to take hard decisions and to do the politically impossible, which is something that I guess Volcker and Thatcher particularly stand out for having done without necessarily endorsing those decisions, I think. Anyway, so we're that's the end of this, the free section of this. We're going to continue on and have a more open discussion, I guess, about our times in which so much seems politically impossible, in which promises have been broken, and in which promises are no longer made. But that'll be all over on Patreon at patreon.com/BungaCast, and that's it for the free show. But let me thank you already in this intermediary break, and then we'll continue.